A breaking news update on the Nancy Guthrie case. The masked suspect appeared at her front door earlier than the night police believe she was kidnapped. That's according to sources familiar with the investigation. The center photo you see here, released by the FBI, shows the suspect at Guthrie's doorstep without a backpack. Investigators believe the photo was taken before February 1st. That was the day she disappeared. The FBI has said the other images of the suspect with a backpack are from the morning of her disappearance. Nancy Guthrie is the mother of Today Show host Savannah Guthrie.
Tonight, the Pima County Sheriff tells CBS News that investigators have not ruled out an accomplice who may have entered Nancy Guthrie's home. This, as Sheriff Chris Nano says, the doorbell video of the masked male suspect seen outside Guthrie's front door is the only video they've been able to recover so far from multiple cameras at her home.
At 2:28 in the morning, something inside Nancy Guthrie's home went silent. Not a scream, not an alarm. Her heart monitor. Minutes earlier, a figure dressed in black stood outside her front door, studying the camera like he knew exactly where to look. Then the footage cut. Now, weeks later, investigators say they've uncovered new evidence. Evidence that may finally point to a suspect. But here's the part that changes everything. The DNA doesn't belong to a stranger. And if that's true, this case was never random. Investigators now believe the first critical mistake in this case wasn't made by the suspect. It was made by everyone watching. For weeks, the focus remained on what happened outside Nancy Guthrie's home. The masked figure, the disabled camera, the narrow window between recorded movement and the moment her medical device stopped transmitting. But according to new investigative updates, law enforcement sources confirm the timeline is no longer centered on the front door. It begins inside the house. Nancy Guthrie, 84, returned home just before 10 p.m. after spending the evening with family. She lived alone in the Catalina foothills area of Tucson, Arizona. Neighbors described the area as quiet, residential, and low crime. Nancy had lived in Tucson for decades, so she managed her home independently, despite mobility limitations, and relied on daily medication and a heart monitor linked to her phone. Nothing about that evening raised concern. At 9:50 p.m., her garage door closed. That detail has been confirmed through surveillance timestamps. For nearly 3 hours, there is no unusual activity. Then, just after 1 a.m., a person dressed in dark clothing approaches the front of the house, and the doorbell camera captures partial footage before the lens is obstructed and later disabled. Law enforcement later confirmed the camera housing showed signs of force. That footage was released publicly by the FBI. But here is where the new development matters. For weeks, many assumed the masked individual disabled the camera before entering. Investigators are now examining whether access may have already been gained. According to officials involved in the case, a digital forensic review of Nancy's phone and home systems suggests interior activity before the exterior camera was disrupted. Authorities have not released full details, but they confirm that the timeline inside the home is being reassessed. That changes everything. Because if entry occurred earlier than originally believed, the event was not spontaneous. It was planned. And that brings us to the new evidence. So the FBI has confirmed that DNA collected from the property does not match Nancy Guthrie or any immediate family member. That DNA was entered into CODIS, the National Combined DNA Index System. There were no matches. When a DNA profile does not return a result in CODIS, it typically means one of two things. The person has never been convicted of a qualifying offense, or the sample belongs to someone not yet identified in the database. Investigators have since expanded their forensic approach beyond CODIS. While authorities have not publicly detailed the methods being used, law enforcement officials have confirmed they are reviewing additional biological evidence collected both inside and outside the residence. That includes trace material recovered during secondary searches. This is not routine. When investigators return to a property after the initial processing, and it usually indicates either new information has surfaced or earlier findings require closer review. In Nancy Guthrie's case, detectives re-entered the home days after the initial search. Evidence markers were repositioned. Items were redocumented. Digital devices were re-examined. The reason, according to officials, is that something did not align. At the center of this shift is the 16-minute gap between the final exterior footage and the medical device disconnect. 16 minutes. So for weeks, that window defined the case. Now investigators believe the activity may have begun before that clock started. If true, that suggests familiarity with the property. And that is where attention has narrowed. Authorities have repeatedly stated that no official suspect has been named. Sheriff Chris Nanos of the Pima County Sheriff's Department has emphasized that investigators are examining all possibilities. The FBI has echoed that position. However, multiple searches of a specific residence have been confirmed. Annie Guthrie, Nancy's daughter, and Annie's husband, Tommaso Chayon, live approximately 4 miles from Nancy's home. Public records confirm that investigators conducted 2 searches at their residence, one consensual and one under warrant. Law enforcement has not disclosed what prompted the second search. They have also not disclosed what was collected. But here is the key point. A second warrant requires judicial approval based on probable cause. It is not procedural repetition. It signals that investigators believe additional evidence may be located at that address. That does not mean guilt. It means scrutiny. Tommaso Chayon was the last documented person to see Nancy alive. He drove her home after dinner. That fact has been confirmed by both family members and investigators. In high-profile disappearances, the last person to see the victim often receives immediate attention. That is standard investigative protocol. What makes this development different is timing. Sources close to the investigation indicate that law enforcement focused on specific movements in the hours after Nancy was dropped off. Those movements are not public, but digital tracking data, including vehicle movement, cellular activity, and timestamps, are part of the evidence review. That is the new evidence referenced in recent briefings. Not a public confession, not a dramatic arrest. Digital reconstruction. Modern investigations rely heavily on data. Door sensors, phone pings, vehicle systems, home networks. Even in cases where surveillance footage is limited, metadata often tells a more precise story than eyewitness accounts. According to officials, multiple data points from the night Nancy disappeared are being synchronized to create a minute-by-minute reconstruction. That process is ongoing, and it has produced what investigators describe as a person of interest. Authorities have not publicly named that individual. However, they confirm that investigative focus has narrowed. When asked whether family members have been cleared, Sheriff Nanos stated that no one has been fully eliminated from consideration. That statement is important. It means the investigation remains active and fluid. It also means speculation must be handled carefully. This is where we pause and address something directly. In high-profile cases involving public figures, and Nancy Guthrie is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, co-anchor of NBC's Today Show. Media coverage accelerates quickly. Rumors spread. Online commentary grows louder. But investigators move at a different pace. They build cases through corroboration. And corroboration takes time. The FBI has confirmed receiving more than 30,000 tips. That volume creates both opportunity and distraction. Each tip must be reviewed, logged, and evaluated. At the same time, forensic labs continue processing material. The reward for information leading to Nancy's recovery now stands at $100,000. $50,000 from the FBI and $50,000 from the family. Reward increases typically occur when investigators believe public cooperation may produce actionable leads. So they do not increase rewards without reason. Now consider this. Authorities have also confirmed reviewing surveillance footage from surrounding neighborhoods within a 5-mile radius. That includes footage from private residences and businesses. One particular clip, recorded at a property miles away from Nancy's home, shows a person carrying a backpack similar in design to the one worn by the masked figure at Nancy's door. Our investigators have not confirmed whether that individual is connected, but they are examining the timing. The timing is everything. If a vehicle traveled between those two locations within the available window, investigators can determine likely routes. Traffic cameras, license plate readers, and intersection surveillance can narrow that path. That is how modern cases are solved. Quietly. Through data. And this is where the shift in narrative matters. For weeks, and the case centered on a masked stranger. Now, investigators are evaluating whether the suspect was someone with knowledge of the home's layout and Nancy's routine. That distinction changes public perception, because random attacks are unpredictable. Targeted events are traceable. The difference lies in planning. As of this recording, no arrests have been made. No formal charges have been filed. But law enforcement confirms that new evidence has tightened the circle. And that is why this case is no longer just about disappearance. It is about identification. If you are new to this channel, now is the time to subscribe. We do not chase headlines. We track developments. We verify updates. And when new evidence shifts a case, we break it down clearly, without speculation, without exaggeration. Because in cases like this, precision matters. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. Her family continues to make public appeals for information. And Savannah Guthrie has addressed viewers directly, asking for cooperation and for anyone with knowledge to contact authorities. Those statements are measured, and they do not accuse. They ask. And investigators are responding in kind, by building a case that can stand in court. The next chapter will examine the digital reconstruction process in detail. How law enforcement analyzes home systems, vehicle data, and phone records to determine whether the suspect's movements match the physical evidence collected. Because the new evidence may not be dramatic, but it may be decisive. And when investigators say a suspect has been found, what they often mean is this: the data is pointing somewhere, and they are closing in. Nancy Guthrie disappeared in the early hours of February 1st, 2026. Since then, every minute has been accounted for, except one. And that minute may now belong to someone investigators believe they can identify. By the second week of the investigation, law enforcement shifted resources toward one central objective: reconstructing movement through data. Not theory, not rumor. Data. The Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed that multiple forms of digital evidence were under review. That includes cellular records, home network logs, vehicle system data, and geolocation timestamps. When physical evidence leaves gaps, digital records often fill them. This case is no exception. Investigators began with Nancy Guthrie's personal devices. Her phone, tablet, and home Wi-Fi router were collected for forensic imaging. Digital forensics specialists extract complete system copies before analysis. That preserves metadata, connection times, login attempts, background processes, and network traffic. Authorities confirmed that Nancy's devices showed no outgoing communication after she returned home that night. No calls, no text messages, no emergency attempts. That absence is significant. It suggests either she had no opportunity to use her phone or her phone was not accessible. Next came cellular mapping. Law enforcement requested tower pings covering a radius around Nancy's home during the early morning hours. Cell providers retain connection logs that show which devices registered with nearby towers. Investigators are not looking for names at this stage. They look for unknown numbers that appeared briefly and then disappeared. Temporary presence stands out. According to sources familiar with the case, analysts isolated several devices that connected to towers near Nancy's property during the window under review. Most were consistent with normal residential traffic. A few were not. Those numbers are now being traced through subscriber records and historical movement patterns. This is standard in targeted abduction cases. Patterns matter more than one-time hits. Simultaneously, detectives reviewed vehicle telematics. Modern vehicles store more data than most drivers realize. Ignition times, door openings, mileage intervals, GPS logs in some models. Even vehicles without subscription navigation often retain event data internally. When investigators execute a warrant on a vehicle, they extract onboard computer information. See, that process can reveal whether a car moved during specific time frames and whether doors were opened or closed. The Sheriff's Department confirmed that at least one vehicle associated with the case was examined under warrant. They have not publicly released findings, but here is what we know from official statements. The vehicle analysis was requested after new digital correlations surfaced. That timing matters. If a vehicle's movement aligns with unexplained cellular activity, investigators gain a stronger picture of sequence. In parallel, neighborhood surveillance canvassing intensified. Deputies knocked on doors within a multi-mile radius. They requested access to private security systems, doorbell cameras, and driveway recorders. In suburban investigations, private footage often outperforms city cameras because residential systems capture sustained motion rather than traffic snapshots. And authorities have confirmed they reviewed hours of footage from homes along potential access routes. They are not only looking for the masked figure. They are looking for vehicles that appear more than once. Repeated drive-bys, slow turns, lights switching off before entry. These patterns build a behavioral profile. According to statements made during press briefings, investigators also analyzed power grid data. Utility companies maintain records of service fluctuations. If lights were turned on or off abruptly in adjacent homes, that data sometimes correlates with outdoor movement or door activity. It may sound minor. It is not. In cases without witnesses, digital breadcrumbs become the witness. Now, consider the interior environment. Detectives brought in specialists trained in digital timeline synthesis. That process merges all available data: phones, routers, vehicle logs, surveillance clips, into a unified timeline. The goal is simple: identify inconsistencies. If one device shows activity at 1:12 a.m., but a corresponding system shows inactivity, that gap demands explanation. Authorities have not disclosed the specifics of the discrepancies they found. They have confirmed that the timeline reconstruction led them to re-interview individuals connected to Nancy. Re-interviews are strategic. Detectives compare previous statements against newly developed data. They measure accuracy against timestamps. In high-profile cases, interviews are recorded and preserved. Language matters. Wording matters. Time references matter. Investigators are trained to detect drift, small shifts in narrative over time. That is where psychological depth enters the investigation. When someone describes events from memory, small details either stabilize or shift under pressure. Detectives assess consistency without revealing the evidence they possess. Sheriff Chris Nanos stated publicly that all interviews are conducted with professionalism and that no one has been declared a suspect at this stage. That wording is deliberate. It maintains investigative flexibility. Meanwhile, the FBI joined local authorities to assist with data analysis. Federal resources expand technological capabilities, especially when dealing with complex digital mapping. The FBI confirmed that behavioral analysts were consulted. A behavioral analysis does not determine guilt. It evaluates likelihood. It studies planning indicators, risk tolerance, and knowledge of the environment. In cases involving older victims, analysts often examine whether the event appears opportunistic or directed. Directed events show preparation, knowledge of routines, understanding of entry points, awareness of vulnerabilities. Those elements are now central to the review. Publicly, our investigators have stated that there are no confirmed signs of forced entry at the primary access points of the home. That statement is careful. It does not eliminate entry. It suggests access may have occurred through an unsecured route or through familiarity. If access did not require force, it narrows the field. This is where the investigation intersects with psychology. People who commit planned offenses often rehearse mentally. They visualize sequence. They anticipate obstacles, so they minimize risk. Digital evidence can confirm whether rehearsal occurred. For example, prior drive-bys captured on neighborhood cameras, cell devices appearing near the property days earlier, vehicle logs indicating proximity before the event date. Authorities have not confirmed such findings publicly, but they have confirmed that historical location data is under review. Historical movement matters. If a device appears near a property repeatedly over several days, that device becomes a focal point. Investigators also reviewed financial activity. Bank card usage, online purchases, and subscription renewals can indicate planning behavior. Specific items purchased in advance may align with evidence recovered at a scene. Again, officials have not released details. They have confirmed financial records were subpoenaed. Each subpoena requires judicial authorization. Each request must demonstrate investigative relevance. By the end of week 2, The digital timeline reconstruction had identified a narrower cluster of interest. Authorities are careful with language. They refer to individuals as persons of interest rather than suspects unless charges are imminent. A person of interest is someone whose behavior or proximity requires further evaluation. That distinction protects both the investigation and the individual's legal standing. Now we address motive. Investigators always consider motive. But motive follows evidence, not the other way around. Was this financially driven? Was it personal? Was it targeted for reasons unrelated to family? At this stage, law enforcement has not publicly attributed motive to any theory. However, officials confirm they are examining insurance records, estate documents, and communication history. That is routine when the victim is elderly and independent. Routine does not imply wrongdoing. It implies thoroughness. And the case has drawn national attention partly because Nancy Guthrie is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, co-anchor of NBC's Today Show. That connection increases scrutiny. It also increases pressure. But investigators have emphasized that the case is being handled based on evidence, not profile. Meanwhile, the volume of tips continues to grow. More than 30,000 tips have been logged. The FBI's tip line remains active. Analysts sort credible leads from background noise. A tip triage follows a structured process: verification, cross-reference, dismissal, or escalation. Every credible tip is checked against the digital timeline. If a tip references a specific vehicle, investigators review whether that vehicle appears in surveillance. If a tip references a specific individual, detectives cross-check cellular presence and known location records. Most tips do not survive this filtering. A few do. When investigators say new evidence has tightened the focus, they are referring to convergence. When digital records, surveillance, interviews, and physical evidence point in the same direction, the margin of error shrinks. That is where this case now stands. The investigation is no longer broad. It is methodical. And the next phase will determine whether the digital trail supports charges or eliminates key individuals entirely. If you value careful analysis over noise, subscribe now. We follow the evidence as it develops, and we separate fact from speculation. And when new developments surface, you will hear them here first, clearly and without exaggeration. Nancy Guthrie remains missing, but her case is no longer undefined. It is being reconstructed minute by minute. And in modern investigations, data rarely lies. The question is not whether the truth exists in the record. The question is who that record is pointing toward. In most missing person investigations, the public sees a small fraction of what detectives actually do. A few lines in a press release, a photo, a tip number. This case did not follow that pattern. From the first week, Nancy Guthrie's disappearance became a national headline, and the investigation entered a new environment, one where every decision, every sentence, and every silence would be judged in real time. That pressure did not come from one place. It came from everywhere at once. National news outlets, social media accounts posting updates with no sourcing, true crime channels chasing speed, and, critically, a media dispute that moved attention away from facts and toward accusation. By February 6, 2026, authorities publicly acknowledged they were investigating a new message connected to the case and reviewing it for authenticity. That detail mattered because it signaled two things at once. Someone was trying to insert information into the investigation, and law enforcement could not assume that information was real. In a high-profile case, messages can be a real lead, a hoax, or an attempt to misdirect. Investigators have to treat all three possibilities as live until proven otherwise. That is the reality of modern true crime coverage. The public wants answers now. Investigators cannot move on public demand. They move on verification. So, the Sheriff's Department and the FBI did what agencies do when a case becomes crowded with speculation. They narrowed what they said, and they widened what they asked for. In official statements reported by multiple outlets, investigators requested video footage from the public. Anything showing vehicles, vehicle traffic, pedestrians, or anything unusual covering a broad date range from January 1st, 2026 through February 2nd, 2026. That request tells you how investigators were working the case in parallel lanes. One lane is the immediate night and early morning window. The other lane is preparation, people and vehicles that may have appeared before the disappearance and didn't stand out at the time. That public request did something else too. It moved responsibility outward. When a department asks a community to check cameras across a full month, it's not a casual ask, and it's a recognition that crucial pieces may sit on private systems that no warrant can instantly reach. It's also a signal that investigators believe movement patterns, who was near the home, when, and how often, could matter as much as what happened on the night itself. At the same time, official language stayed guarded. Authorities were careful not to name a suspect, and they did not declare a single person as the one. They avoided statements that would lock them into a public theory before the evidence was complete. That restraint is often misunderstood. To viewers, restraint can look like uncertainty. To investigators, restraint is protection. It protects the integrity of interviews. It protects future court proceedings. And it protects innocent people from being branded by an allegation that has not been tested. But restraint creates a vacuum. And in a vacuum, other voices get louder. By early February, a second storyline rose alongside the official investigation. A media-driven suspect narrative centered on Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni. This is where the case's public perception began to split. On one side, law enforcement repeatedly signaled that they were not publicly naming suspects. On the other side, a journalist, Ashley Banfield, used her true crime podcast to describe information from an unnamed law enforcement source and framed Nancy's son-in-law as a potential prime suspect, language that quickly circulated online and was repeated across platforms. This was not a casual controversy. It became a structural problem for the investigation. Because once a person is publicly labeled in the court of public opinion, and everything they do becomes evidence to strangers who do not have the case file, normal behavior becomes suspicious. Silence becomes suspicious. Cooperating becomes suspicious. Hiring a lawyer becomes suspicious. Even grief becomes suspicious. That public atmosphere can make witnesses less willing to speak. It can also make legitimate tips harder to sort, because tips start to mirror online theories rather than real observations. Law enforcement recognized that risk. As the Banfield claims spread, Sheriff Chris Nanos and his department publicly pushed back. Coverage noted that the sheriff described the reporting as reckless, and warned it could harm the investigation and harm individuals. There is a reason agencies rarely attack media coverage directly. They prefer to keep a working relationship with reporters. They prefer to manage information flow without escalating a public fight. So when a sheriff goes on the record to denounce coverage, it usually means investigators believe the public narrative is interfering with investigative work. And it wasn't only about interference, it was also about boundaries. The sheriff's department had to communicate something to the public without revealing evidence, that the case was bigger than one podcast claim, and that the public was not entitled to an unverified suspect name simply because the case involved a well-known family. At the same time, Banfield doubled down. Reports describe her repeating the claim and defending her source publicly, including during an interview with Dan Abrams on his Sirius XM show. That interview widened the controversy because it put the dispute on a larger stage and framed the question as a showdown: anonymous source versus official denial. This is the trap that high-profile investigations can fall into. When the story becomes who is lying, the focus slides away from what matters most: locating the missing person and identifying whoever is responsible through evidence that can be proven. This is not only a media problem, it becomes a psychological problem, because public accusation changes how people behave. People who might have information become cautious. Some become fearful. Some become defensive. Some decide it's safer to say nothing than to become the next target of online attention. And that has an impact investigators cannot ignore. One of the clearest examples in this case is how investigators handled public tips. The FBI publicly posted a reward notice for information leading to Nancy Guthrie's recovery or the arrest and conviction of anyone involved. That notice is more than a public appeal. It's also a filter. People respond differently when a reward exists. Some come forward who were unsure. Some come forward for the wrong reasons. Now, the reward notice brings volume. Investigators then have to separate signal from noise. This case produced enormous volume, and volume has a cost. Every tip has to be logged. Every tip has to be checked against known information. If a tip claims a sighting, investigators evaluate whether the location and time align with verified data. If a tip names a person, investigators evaluate whether the tip originates from real-world contact or from online rumor. Well, this is where the public rarely sees the reality. Investigators don't just get leads, they manage lead quality. When a case becomes national, the tip line becomes a funnel not just for facts, but for anxiety, attention, and sometimes manipulation. Some callers genuinely want to help. Others want to be part of the story. Some repeat a headline, some repeat a video, some repeat a comment section. The work is sorting. In this case, that sorting happened under a spotlight. Because Nancy Guthrie is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, a major television figure. That connection turned a local case into a national one instantly. Coverage emphasized the family's public profile, and it brought in viewers who had never heard of the Catalina foothills before this story. With that attention came another layer of pressure, public expectation of speed. Viewers often assume that when a case is famous, it will be solved fast. More resources, more cameras, more investigators, more urgency. But high-profile cases can slow down for the same reason they speed up. Every step becomes sensitive. every search becomes visible. Every rumor becomes a problem. Every release of information becomes a decision with consequences. And every decision is made while family members are living in public view. This is where the human side intersects with the investigative side, and it does so without needing graphic detail to feel heavy. A family asking for help is one thing. A family being asked to defend itself against public theories is another. As the public discussion escalated, reporting indicated that Sheriff Nanos later issued a strong statement clearing the Guthrie family and denouncing what he described as cruel media focus on them as suspects. That kind of statement is not routine. It functions like a line drawn in the sand, investigators refusing to let speculation turn into a second victimization. That moment mattered, not because it solved anything, because it clarified the stakes. Law enforcement was not only investigating Nancy's disappearance, they were also managing the public damage created by unverified accusations. That is a hard balance. If investigators say too little, people fill in the blanks. If investigators say too much, they risk compromising interviews, evidence, and eventual prosecution. So, they rely on controlled releases. A reward notice, a request for video, a message review confirmation, and careful statements that avoid naming suspects. That's why this chapter matters. Because breaking, new evidence and suspect found does not only refer to lab work or surveillance, it also refers to narrative control. In cases like this, investigators often know far more than they can say, and the public often believes far more than has been proven. Those two realities collide in the media space. And the collision can either help the case by generating a real tip from someone who recognizes something, or harm it by turning the investigation into a spectacle. So if you're watching this and you care about true crime for the right reasons, here is the line that matters. Facts first, not guesses, not viral clips, not unnamed sources repeated until they sound true. If you want coverage that stays tight to confirmed reporting and official records, subscribe now. Not because we want numbers, because cases like this get noisy fast, and you need one place that stays disciplined, one place that does not trade accuracy for speed. By mid-February, investigators were still reviewing messages, still collecting public video, and still navigating the fallout of a media war that centered attention on one name while the agencies refused to put a name on the record. That gap between what the public demands and what investigators can legally prove is where pressure lives. And pressure changes behavior. It changes what witnesses say. It changes what people believe they saw. It changes how fast rumors move. It changes how families are treated. And it changes how law enforcement communicates. Nancy Guthrie's case became a test of that system. Not only the system that finds missing people, and the system that decides what truth looks like before the courtroom ever sees it. That is where we leave this chapter. The next step is not louder coverage. It is quieter proof. And the people doing the work know that the moment they choose a suspect publicly, they need more than suspicion. They need a case that survives the hardest question of all. Can you prove it? The first major change in this investigation did not come from a press conference. It came from a roadside recovery. So on February 12th, investigators located a black glove about 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's residence, in an open area near the side of a road. The FBI later described it as potentially linked to the person seen in the available surveillance imagery. At first glance, a discarded glove sounds ordinary. In a missing person case, it can be anything but. Because a glove is not just clothing, it can be a carrier of trace evidence. It can hold fibers, soil, and biological material. It can show wear patterns. It can even help investigators estimate how recently it was left in that location. The FBI publicly stated that the glove appears to match the gloves worn by the subject seen in the surveillance footage, and that it contains DNA evidence. That statement is careful. It does not claim the glove belongs to the person in the footage. It says it appears to match what is visible, and it contains a DNA profile. That is an important difference, because in court, appears to match is not proof. It is a lead. And from that lead, the case begins to shift toward what this title promises: new evidence and a suspect direction. What investigators do with a glove like this: once an item is recovered and properly logged, it is transported under chain of custody rules. That means the item is sealed, labeled, and documented at each transfer point, so the evidence can be defended later. Then the lab work begins. On the first step is visual inspection and documentation. Investigators photograph the glove from multiple angles, record condition details, and note anything obvious: tears, residue, markings, or manufacturing tags. Next is controlled sampling. A lab does not test the entire glove at once. Technicians focus on high-contact zones, the areas most likely to retain usable material. On a glove, that often includes the fingertips, inner palm, wrist seam, and outer surface if it appears handled. From there, DNA extraction begins. If a sample is usable, analysts can create a DNA profile. A profile is not a full identity. It is a coded set of genetic markers that can be compared against other samples. In this case, investigators made two key public points. The FBI indicated that the glove contains DNA evidence and that it appears to match the gloves worn by the person seen in surveillance imagery. Word the Pima County Sheriff's Department later said that DNA from a glove did not yield a match, and also did not match a separate sample found at Nancy Guthrie's home. Those statements sound confusing until you understand how evidence works in real investigations. There can be more than one glove, there can be more than one sample, and there can be more than one profile under analysis at the same time. Yet the Sheriff's Department spokesperson clarified that the DNA from the glove did not match the sample recovered at the residence. So why does the glove still matter? Because investigators are not treating this like a single test, single answer case. They are building a matrix of comparisons. If a glove has a profile and the residence has a separate profile, that can mean multiple individuals were involved, or that one of the samples is not connected to the core event. See, it can also mean contamination, transfer, or unrelated contact at the property. That's why investigators do not rush to declare the DNA match as the conclusion. They treat it as direction. The new part: where the lab goes when CODIS fails. When a DNA profile is developed, the first major comparison route is CODIS, the National Criminal DNA Database. But CODIS only contains profiles collected under specific legal categories, generally tied to criminal arrests or convictions, and depending on jurisdiction and federal rules. If a profile does not match anyone in CODIS, it does not mean the person is unknown. It means they are not in that database. Investigators then have two next steps: expand comparisons against any other profiles collected in the case. Consider other legal methods, including commercial genealogical databases, depending on policy, warrant requirements, and agency rules. In this investigation, the Pima County Sheriff's Department stated that investigators were turning to commercial genealogical databases in the absence of a match. That is a major shift. Commercial genealogical searches do not typically identify a person directly. They look for partial matches to relatives who have opted into law enforcement matching in those databases, depending on the database policies. From there, investigators can build family trees and narrow the pool. It is not instant. It is work. And it changes the meaning of new suspect. Because in a genealogy-led investigation, a suspect may start as a cluster, a family line, a geographic circle, a set of male relatives in a certain age range. Then it narrows, one branch at a time. Why this approach matters for the title, your title, is Breaking: New Evidence and Suspect Found in the Nancy Guthrie's Case. The new evidence is not a confession or a dramatic on-camera moment, and it is a forensic pathway that can produce a real name. And in true crime investigations, that is often how the biggest answers arrive, quietly, through lab gates and policy steps. This is where viewers often misunderstand the pace. When investigators say they are waiting on DNA results, they may be waiting on extraction confirmation, profile development, quality checks, comparison runs, retesting for verification, legal review for genealogy submission. In this case, local reporting noted that law enforcement was waiting for confirmation of DNA testing connected to gloves recovered near Nancy Guthrie's home. Waiting does not mean stalled. It means the lab is inside the decision tree. The flyer updates and what suspect details really mean. When the FBI releases or updates a missing person flyer, every word is chosen carefully. Those flyers are built for two goals: public recognition, tip relevance. Local reporting said that with the release of surveillance images and videos, the FBI updated the Nancy Guthrie missing person flyer. Flyer updates typically include things like physical description of the subject seen in footage, clothing details, items carried, bags, packs, direction of travel if known, tip line info. None of that is proof, but it helps someone out there connect a memory to a case. A neighbor who saw someone dressed similarly. A driver who noticed a person walking where they shouldn't have been. A store employee who remembers a purchase. That is how cold visual evidence becomes warm human recognition. And recognition leads to a name. That is the suspect found moment the public often expects. Not a public accusation. A privately identified lead that investigators can verify through records, interviews, and lawful evidence collection. What law enforcement has said about the situation at the residence. In active cases, rumors spread fast, especially around searches and detentions. Here is what has been publicly clarified by the Sheriff's Department. When investigators serve a warrant at a residence, anyone inside is technically detained as part of standard procedure, so investigators can safely conduct the search. That clarification matters because it prevents the public from misreading standard procedure as proof of guilt. And a detention during a search is not an arrest. It is control of the scene. That distinction protects the investigation and prevents misinformation from becoming fact online. Why investigators reduce public updates as evidence becomes sensitive. As evidence becomes more technical, especially when genealogy and lab comparisons are involved, agencies often limit public statements. Recent reporting noted that on February 24th, the Pima County Sheriff's Department said it would limit further updates unless new information warrants release. That is what you do when you are approaching a critical point. You don't want public chatter to shape witness statements. You don't want false confessions or attention seekers showing up. You don't want the person responsible to learn what you have. Less talk, more proof. What the public can do that actually helps investigators have made one public request that is both broad and specific. Provide footage. Not opinions, not theories. Footage. Local reporting states the department sent alerts to neighbors within a 2-mile radius asking for surveillance footage covering January 1st through February 2nd. That request says investigators believe preparation may have left traces. Vehicles passing repeatedly. Patterns that only become obvious once investigators know where to look. If you are watching this documentary for the truth and not the noise, this is the moment to subscribe. Because this is where cases change. Not with rumors, with lab results, legal steps, and patient, methodical work that turns an unknown profile into a real-world identity. And once investigators have that identity, everything else becomes testable. Was that person near the area? Do they have a reason to be there? Do their devices and movements align with known timelines? Do they have a link to the recovered evidence? The glove is not the end. It's a door, a forensic door, and the case is now moving through it. When a case goes public at this level, something almost always happens. Someone reaches out. Sometimes it's real. Sometimes it's a lie. Sometimes it's a person trying to hijack attention. And sometimes it's the person responsible trying to control the story. In early February 2026, authorities confirmed they were evaluating a message connected to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. Public reporting described it as a message linked to potential kidnappers. But even in that wording, the uncertainty is built in. The word potential is doing heavy work there. Because until law enforcement confirms who sent it and why, it is not evidence of anything. It is only a signal that someone wants to be heard. And that moment matters. Because the first message often becomes the first psychological contest in a high-profile case. Investigators have to make decisions fast, but they cannot act emotionally. They have to assume every message could be a trap for the family, a trap for the public, and a trap for the investigation. What the public heard first. The message became public through family-facing statements and media coverage. Savannah Guthrie, Nancy's daughter and co-anchor of NBC's Today Show, released a video plea. In reporting on that video, the family acknowledges receiving a message and says they are willing to pay for Nancy's safe return. That kind of statement is not made casually. When families speak publicly in cases like this, it's usually because they believe there is a real chance the person watching will respond to pressure, or because investigators think the public appeal can create a reaction that produces a lead. But there's a risk. Once you say, "We will pay," you invite copycats. You invite hoaxers who want money. You invite people who want attention. And you invite people who want to send the investigation in circles. That is why investigators treat every communication like a forensic object. It has to be tested, not believed. The ransom note story, and what can be verified around the same time, an entertainment outlet reported receiving an alleged ransom note demanding a substantial amount of Bitcoin, claiming the amount was in the millions and providing a specific Bitcoin address. The report said they verified the address exists. Here's what the public often misses. Verifying a Bitcoin address exists is not the same as verifying the sender is real. A Bitcoin address can be created in minutes. Anyone can generate one. So investigators don't stop at the address exists. They look at the blockchain. They check whether the address has prior activity. They track whether the address was created and posted in connection with other scams. They monitor whether funds move through it. And they set up controlled pathways so that if money does move, it leaves a trail. That's why cryptocurrency demands don't automatically mean the sender is smart. In many cases, they're careless. Because cryptocurrency isn't invisible. It's recorded, and every movement becomes a line investigators can follow. That is the tension in this chapter. A message can look powerful, but it can also expose the sender. What law enforcement has to decide first. When authorities learn of a message tied to a missing person case, there are immediate decisions behind the scenes. Decision 1. Is this message direct, or is it secondhand? A message to a family is one thing. A message to a media outlet is another. A message posted online is another. The more steps between sender and investigator, the higher the risk of distortion. Decision 2. Is the sender asking for money or trying to control behavior? Money demands matter, but so do instructions like don't call police, don't go public, leave town, wait, come alone, or use a specific device. Those instructions are often more informative than the demand itself. They reveal what the sender fears. On Decision 3, is there proof? Families often ask for a basic verification. Investigators do too. Public reporting around this case made clear that the family's position was that they needed confirmation that Nancy was actually being held before anything could move forward. That's not just emotional, that's practical. Because hoaxers will demand payment without proof. A real offender may also refuse proof. But refusal becomes a data point. Every response becomes a data point. On Decision 4, does engaging help or harm? In some cases, investigators advise families not to respond publicly. In other cases, they coordinate a public message that is carefully worded. When families speak without coordination, they can accidentally reveal what investigators know or don't know. They can also trigger the sender to change tactics. That's why, when a family goes public with a strong offer, "We will pay," you can assume investigators are watching closely. Not because they want drama, because they want reaction. The sheriff's posture, cautious optimism, controlled language. In early coverage, the sheriff expressed cautious belief that Nancy could still be alive. That posture, reported publicly, is both hope and strategy. It keeps the public engaged. It keeps tips coming. It avoids locking the investigation into one outcome. That kind of statement is designed to keep the case active in the public mind. But it also has a second function. If the person responsible is watching, a statement like that can pressure them to communicate again. Or it can pressure them into a mistake. Investigators are trained to watch for that. Why messages don't advance the case the way people think. When a message becomes public, viewers often assume it means the case is about to break wide open. Sometimes it does. Usually it doesn't. Because most messages are messy. They don't include verifiable details, and they recycle information already on the news. They use broad threats. They focus on money, and they avoid anything that could be traced. So investigators look for what the sender cannot easily hide. Language patterns, word choice, phrasing habits, spelling quirks, technical fingerprints, device type, upload metadata if available, how it was transmitted. Time patterns, when the sender is active, how quickly they respond, whether they avoid certain hours. Geographic leakage, cellular routing, VPN mistakes, account logins. Behavioral tells, how they react to public statements, whether they escalate, whether they stall. Even a message delivered through media can carry clues. Investigators work those clues quietly. That is why the public often feels like nothing is happening. A lot is happening. It's just not visible. And the family's public line: speak to the person watching. The family's video pleas were not just grief, they were targeted communication. They were designed to reach the person who might be holding Nancy, or someone who knows something and hasn't spoken. Public reporting described Savannah's video as direct, acknowledging the message, stating the family's willingness to pay, and asking for contact. A later coverage described another family-facing video message, urging anyone involved or anyone with knowledge to come forward. The key here is tone. In many cases, families are advised to avoid threats in public messages, not because threats aren't understandable, but because threats can make the situation less predictable. Families often choose language that leaves a door open. That door is not for the offender's comfort, it's for leverage. Because if the person responsible believes there is a path out, some way to communicate, they may communicate again, and each communication increases the chance of traceable error. Why investigators hate public deadlines. One of the details in public reporting around alleged ransom messaging is the idea of deadlines and large demands. Deadlines create urgency for viewers. For investigators, deadlines create problems because deadlines push families to act quickly. And quick action is where mistakes happen, especially if money is involved. Investigators prefer to slow the pace, even when a message demands speed. They slow it with controlled responses. They slow it with verification demands. They slow it by forcing the sender to repeat themselves. Because repetition is where cracks appear. A hoaxer can write one convincing message. It's harder to maintain a consistent lie over multiple exchanges. A real offender can maintain a consistent lie. But consistency can still expose patterns. Either way, controlled engagement helps. The role of major platform coverage. This is also where Nancy Guthrie's case differs from most. When the missing person is tied to a national TV anchor, the reach is immediate. Millions of people who don't live anywhere near Tucson suddenly know the name, the face, and the basic outline. That coverage helps. More eyes can mean one good tip. But it also creates a serious side effect. When a case is this visible, false leads become a second wave. Investigators have to protect their tip lines from being overwhelmed by people repeating internet theories. They have to protect the family from scams. They have to protect witnesses from harassment. They have to protect evidence from exposure. This is why law enforcement messaging becomes tight. Not because they don't care, because the case becomes fragile under noise, on where the new suspect language starts to form. Now, let's talk about why this chapter connects to the title without making claims law enforcement hasn't made. When the public hears "new suspect found," they imagine a name on a screen. Investigators don't start with a name. They start with a narrowing. And in communication-driven stages of an investigation, narrowing often comes from one of two sources. First, a communication that includes a detail only the offender could know. A detail that isn't on the news. A detail that hasn't been released. Second, a communication that can be traced technically. A mistake in transmission, a reused account, a logged-in device, a pattern. At this stage, authorities have not publicly identified the sender of any message as a confirmed offender. Reporting makes clear that even in Savannah Guthrie's plea, it was not confirmed whether the message was truly from a kidnapper. That is the correct way to frame it, because accuracy is the difference between a documentary and a rumor mill. So in this chapter, the new direction is not a public accusation. It's the fact that communications became part of the evidence stream, and that evidence stream can point toward someone. Even without disturbing detail, the weight of this moment is clear. A family is not only waiting. They are being tested. Tested by silence. Tested by claims. Tested by messages that may or may not be real. And tested by the knowledge that every public sentence might cause a reaction. That kind of pressure changes people. It changes how they talk. It changes how they sleep. It changes how they trust. It also changes how investigators work the case, because investigators must now manage the human side and the technical side at once. When a message enters a case, it doesn't explain anything. It adds another layer, another possible route to the truth, or another attempt to hide it. See a clean call to action that matches the case. If you're watching because you want the clean version of events, verified reporting, clear sourcing, no rumor, subscribe now. Not for hype, for follow-through. Because in cases like this, the biggest shifts don't always happen on camera. They happen when one message turns into two, then three, until the sender slips. Or until a real witness decides they can't stay silent anymore. Right now, here is what is true and on the record. Public reporting confirms the family acknowledged receiving a message connected to the case and made a public plea, including willingness to pay for Nancy's safe return. Public reporting confirms an alleged ransom note demanding Bitcoin was sent to a media outlet. But authenticity of any such note is not established simply by its existence. Public reporting confirms ongoing law enforcement work continues under cautious public language, including public remarks suggesting hope Nancy may still be alive. That is where this chapter ends, not with closure, with pressure. Because once a case enters the message phase, the next move is rarely about what the public thinks. It's about what the sender does next, and whether the investigation can turn that next move into something that holds up, quietly, cleanly, and without doubt.